Hello, my name is Michael Knoll. I'm a professor here at the law school, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the University of Pennsylvania and to our 2018 Gruss lecture. Our lecturer is Professor Christine Hayes from Yale University, where she's the Robert and Patricia Ross Weis Professor of Religious Studies. Professor Hayes is a graduate of Harvard University and Berkeley. Her most recent book, she's the author of many books, many articles, but I just want to mention the most recent one, What's Divine About Divine Law, Early Perspectives, which received the 2015 National Jewish Book Award in Scholarship, a 2016 Prose Award for the Best Book in Theology and Religious Studies, and the 2016 Jordan Schnitzer Award from the Association of Jewish Studies. Professor Hayes is an accomplished and award-winning instructor. At Yale, she teaches courses on literature and the history of biblical and Talmudic periods. Professor Hayes' lecture today is on divine law, a tale of two concepts and three responses. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hayes.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome and introduction, Michael. I also want to begin by thanking Tom Baker and Dean Ruger for inviting me to be the Gruss Visiting Professor of Jewish Law this semester, and for the fantastic staff here, Megan Hackett and Carlin Miller, for all of their terrific logistical support. I also want to thank Stephen Weitzman and the staff at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies for welcoming me as a fellow this semester as well. For the last many years, I've been thinking a lot about divine law and what it means to say that a law is divine. In the book that Professor Knoll referred to, I've argued that two very different conceptions of divine law lie at the base of Western civilization. And so in my book, I try to make sense of the explosive confrontation of these two radically diverse conceptions of divine law in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world in the 1,000-year period prior to the rise of Islam, and it's a confrontation that continues to reverberate today. Divine law can be described as the idea that the norms that guide human actions are somehow rooted in the divine realm. Somehow, we'll get to somehow. And it's a concept that's common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's nothing inevitable about this idea. It's not contained in every culture. I've been told, for example, that in Chinese civilization, law is not connected with the divine. It's connected with elders and wisdom. In the ancient Near East, of course, the gods are guardians of justice who authorize the kings and their rule, and authorize the kings to establish the laws. They confer upon them principles of justice and wisdom essential to their rule. But the laws of the land are produced by the kings themselves and are known by their names, right? The Code of Hammurabi, for example. So a robust notion of divine law, in which divinity applies in some manner to the law itself, first appears in two cultures at roughly the same time, in ancient Greece and in the Hebrew Bible. So that's where our story begins, and this is why it begins. The Greek and the biblical conceptions of the divine are radically different. And to the extent that they conceive of the divine in radically different ways, their notions of divine law will also diverge dramatically. And that's a fact with very serious consequences for those who feel compelled to negotiate the claims of both of these cultural heritages. So what does it mean to say that a law is divine? What claims are we making when we say a law is divine? What are the traits that we're conferring upon it when we refer to it as divine? What's divine about divine law? I want to spend 5 or 6 minutes first laying out the conception of divine law in Greek and Roman tradition before turning to the biblical tradition. And then I want to look at how different groups of ancient Jews representing different intellectual communities responded when these two conceptions collided. So first, in much Greek thought, divine law is divine because it expresses the profound structures of a permanent natural order. The Stoics were the first to use the phrase divine law, theos nomos, to refer to the natural law, which they understood to be the rational order or logos of the universe. For the Stoics, God was coextensive with nature. Nature was divine, and therefore the divine law was the unwritten, eternal, rational order or logos embedded in nature that animates the universe. The later Roman thinker, Cicero, is the one who gives us the classic account of the Stoic theory of natural or divine law. And he writes in text 1 on your handout, "True law is right reason, orthos logos, in agreement with nature, diffused over everyone, consistent, everlasting, whose nature is to advocate duty by prescription and to deter wrongdoing by prohibition. It is wrong to alter this law, nor is it permissible to repeal any part of it," right? It's even ridiculous to think in those terms, and it's impossible to abolish it entirely. There will not be a different law at Rome and at Athens, or a different law now and in the future, but one law, everlasting and immutable, will hold good for all peoples and all times. So for the Stoics, divine law is rational, it is reason. It's true, it's universal, it's eternal, and it's unchanging, static in its perfection, immutable. And very important, it is unwritten. It is not a set of written rules conveyed in words or statements. It's the rational order of the cosmos itself. No human law can invalidate it or restrict it or annul it any more than a law can invalidate gravity. The perfectly rational sage, were such a person to exist, perceives the divine natural law, the rational order or logos embedded in nature, and as the night must follow the day, will follow its order and attain true moral virtue and happiness. Stoic thought, and indeed Greek and later Roman thought in general, assumes an important dichotomy. Now, this will not hold true for the Bible, so we need to be aware of this dichotomy in all of the Greek thinking about divine law. On the one hand, there is natural or divine law, and then on the other hand, separate and distinct from it is human positive law, the laws that humans posit. Positive law consists of concrete rules and prohibitions posited by human beings, delivered in words and sentences, often in written form, and enforced by coercive authority. Positive law isn't universal, it's particular to a given state. It's subject to change and evolution over time. It doesn't necessarily reflect truth. I don't stop at a red light because there's something about redness that makes me truly stop. I agree to do so by convention. So positive law does not necessarily reflect truth or some natural reality. We need the positive laws of states because we lack the rational perfection needed to comprehend and follow the divine natural law embedded in nature. According to Plato, the truly rational man, the philosopher who can perceive the eternal rational truths embedded in the universe, would conform his behavior to the natural order and live justly and virtuously. Text 2. I grant you readily that if ever by God's mercy a man were born with the capacity to attain to this perception, he would need no laws to govern him. No law or ordinance whatever has the right to sovereignty over true knowledge. But as things are, such insight is nowhere to be met with, except in faint vestiges, now and then Socrates on a good day. And so we have to choose the second best, ordinance and law. Now, they can consider most cases and provide for them, but not all. And this is why I have said what I have said. What has he said? He has said that the perfectly rational sage would never need positive human laws. However, most of us lack the rational perfection needed to perceive the truth and order in nature that would lead us toward virtue. So instead, we institute written laws, and they coerce us to a basic civility, not true virtue, which assumes rational perfection and autonomous following of reason. They coerce us to an obedient civility. The positive laws of our cities and states, these are therefore a second best option. Even the best written laws are viewed negatively in the Greek philosophical tradition. A primary reason for their imperfection lies in their very generality. As Plato says, no human law can anticipate all of the circumstances that arise in specific cases. So to be ruled by a static, fixed written law often leads to injustice and suffering. Aristotle criticizes the legislator or judge who cleaves to written law and precedent without employing practical reason, phronesis, good judgment, to make the adjustments needed to bring justice in individual cases. And for Plato, the fact that we must be ruled by positive laws at all is a sign of shame, our fallen status, and the failure of education, and a concession to our rational imperfection. Positive law may bring external obedience, but it doesn't cultivate in us a true moral virtue that comes only from the rational love of the good and the just, rather than from fear of punishment. Indeed, Plato says that written laws require a savior, soter, in the form of logos, reason, the rational guidance of philosopher kings, if the laws are in fact to win our fidelity and bring basic civility. So if you were to ask the ancient Greeks, what's so divine about divine law? They would have answered that divine law is divine by virtue of certain qualities inherent in it. First and foremost, its perfect rationality, it is reason itself, which entails its truth value, its universality, because what's true and rational is true and rational everywhere, and its static, unchanging character. By contrast, in biblical tradition, the law is divine not by virtue of any inherent qualities, but because it emanates from a God who is master of history, because its source is divine. Biblical divine law, meaning the legislation given over to Moses at Sinai, is divine because it is authored by, it is the command of, a deity. It's not the expression of an impersonal, natural, or divine reason, the rational order of the cosmos. Rather, divine law in biblical tradition is a body of actual legislation, rules, and commandments emanating from a divine being. If those, some of you may be familiar only with the 10 Commandments, there are many more. If you keep reading Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, there are hundreds of other commandments and laws. These laws emanate from a divine being. They are the expression of that deity's will. The authority of this law is grounded not in its rational character, but in its commanding source. See text 3. Moses went and repeated to all the people all the commands of Yahweh and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, "All the things that Yahweh has commanded, we will do." And Moses then wrote down all the commands of Yahweh. This divine law is written. He wrote it down. It's not a rational order. It's concrete legislation formulated in words, and it's designed for a particular community. Indeed, when giving the divine law at Sinai, God says explicitly that by obeying his laws, the Israelites will be separated from other nations to be God's people. For this reason, the law must contain some arbitrary, irrational laws that are not universally observed, particularly dietary laws and purity laws that precisely mark the people off as distinct. And because the divine law is a positive enactment of a sovereign will, it's changeable, because that which stems from an act of will can be changed by a subsequent act of will. New rules and ordinances can be issued as long as there's continued access to God's will. And in biblical times, this is achieved by means of ongoing revelation. Moses goes back 4 times to ask God, I don't know what the law is. What should it be? Something new has happened. So God is consulted to ascertain his will. Later, according to Deuteronomy 17, this can continue after Moses' death by consulting with God's representative authorities. In the biblical tradition, variability of the divinely given law in response to the shifting circumstances of human life is part and parcel of divine law, and quite explicitly so. Deuteronomy 13 says, "Now that you're entering the land, you are no longer going to offer sacrifices wherever you wish. You will offer sacrifices at one central sanctuary." New situation, new law. Deuteronomy 17 says, when you enter the land, if you decide you want a king, then here are the rules you will follow for appointing a king. New situation, new rules. Most famously, perhaps, in Numbers 27, the daughters of Salah bring a legal claim before Moses and say, our father died without sons. Why should his land go to his brothers? We think daughters should inherit. Moses says, let me see what God thinks. And God says, you're right. We really should change the law. Moses, write it down. We're going to do it that way from now on. New situation, new rules, no embarrassment. So in the dominant biblical discourse about divine law, I admit it's only one of 3 that I outline in the book, but it's the main one, and it's all we have time for today. So in the dominant biblical discourse about divine law is represented as expressing God's will in written legislation for a particular people, not universal mankind. It comes in the form of a written law that makes this people fit for life in a particular place. And rather than expressing a fixed rational order of universal, timeless, static nature, it is subject to change through time, historical time, as needed. So ancient adherents to biblical tradition would have answered the question, what's divine about divine law, by pointing to its origin in a divine will, a will expressed in history rather than nature. The attribution of divinity did not in itself necessarily or essentially, in biblical tradition, confer upon the law specific qualities such as rationality or conformity to truth or universality or immutability. Some laws of the Torah are rational, certainly, but some are not. Most are particular to Israel and not universal, and they can be adjusted as the need arises. So these very distinctive discourses of divine law collided head-on after Alexander's conquest of the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And this, for the first time, created a cognitive dissonance for Jews living under Hellenistic rule from the 3rd century BCE on. Why did they feel a cognitive dissonance? Because on the face of it, the divine law of biblical tradition possesses many of the features that Greek thought attributed to human law, and only a few of the features Greek thought attributed to divine law. I have a chart on the first page of your handout. So the left-hand column, the right-hand column, this is the Greek dichotomy, the characteristics of divine law and the characteristics of human law on the left and on the right. And you will see that the characteristic traits of human law most closely correspond to the biblical tradition, right? That it's grounded in will, the will of a sovereign authority, that it is written, that it is particular, that it is flexible and changeable, and so on. So this mismatch between the Greek and the biblical conception of divine law was obvious and troubling to ancient Jews, I argue, and they responded to the cognitive dissonance in 3 main ways. I've been studying, actually, recently theories of humor for the sequel to this book, which is going to be on humor, because you'll see this book leads right into humor. And most humor theorists note that humor arises from incongruity, but not all incongruities. Some people have different reactions. For some people, incongruity or cognitive dissonance causes discomfort, and they seek actively to end it. For others, it creates puzzlement, and for others, it creates laughter and humor. And I think we'll see the 3 responses here. One is a panicked response, but we're going to see a humorous response as well. But the first response that I'd like to consider, which is sort of the panicked response, this is the response of Jews who fully embraced Hellenistic values and the Hellenistic binary of divine natural law and human positive law, and the Hellenistic conception of divine law as universal, rational, true, and immutable. Now, these Jews did not want to think of their beloved Torah and did not want others to view their national heritage as anything less than divine law according to the widely accepted criteria of the culture that they so admired, Hellenistic culture. And so they worked like crazy to shoehorn the Mosaic law into the left-hand column of your chart, right? Into that Stoic definition of natural law rather than positive law, bridging the gap between the two by attributing to the Mosaic law the characteristics of the Stoic natural law. The clearest example is Philo. There are other wonderful examples, but we'll look at Philo. Philo, who died around the year 50 of the Common Era, right? So he was a 1st century Alexandrian Jew who believed that since the Torah of the Hebrew Bible was divine, it certainly had to possess the qualities of divine natural law as defined by the Stoic natural law tradition which he embraced. First, he states outright that the law of Moses is in harmony with the principles of eternal nature, meaning the written legislation. And so this is text 4 on your handout. Thus, whoever will carefully examine the nature of the particular enactments will find that they seek to attain to the harmony of the universe and are in agreement with the principles of eternal nature. So Philo identified the Torah, the written laws of Moses, with the Logos, with the natural law governing the cosmos. And having made that identification, he goes on to claim that the Mosaic law possesses the properties and qualities of Stoic natural law. The Torah is universal, it's rational, it's self-identical with truth, it's unchanging, and, best of all, unwritten, which I love that one. How does he establish these claims? Well, first, to support the claim that the Mosaic law is the universal law of the cosmopolis, right, the world city, Philo ignores the immediate narrative context of the giving of the Torah to the Israelites at Sinai to separate them from other peoples, and focuses instead on the fact that the entire story of the law is embedded in a universal narrative that begins with the creation. This, he said, proves that the Torah is intended for the entire created world. Second, he mocks and scolds those who think that the Bible is literature, myth, history, drama, poetry, which was evidently the prevailing view among the Jews in Alexandria until the Hellenistic period. And he claims no scripture contains the canons of truth as he and we know them from philosophy. You'll see in the next line under 4. In the poetic work of God, you will not find anything mythical or fictional, but the canons of truth all inscribed. Third, Philo has to deal with the Torah's writtenness, which in Stoic tradition is an unfailing sign of human law. By definition, if it's written, it's human. So Philo asserts that the written text of the Mosaic Code is simply a copy of an original unwritten law of nature, and he knows this because the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, observed the law before it was given at Sinai in written form. Now, how were they able to do this? Well, because it is natural law, and they were sages with rational perfection. And the rationally perfect sage, we know, can simply read the divine law in nature. So if the patriarchs followed the Torah before it was given in writing at Sinai, and Philo says they did, I'm not sure he read the patriarchal narratives very carefully, then that's because the Torah is natural law, and they knew it from observing nature. Fourth, on the question of change, Philo says that the law of his people has never changed down to the present day, the next section under number 4. But Moses is alone among legislators in this, that his laws, firm, unshaken, immovable, stamped as it were with the seals of nature herself, remain secure from the day when they were first enacted until now. And we may hope that they will remain for all future ages as though immortal, so long as the sun and the moon and the whole heaven and universe exist. In short, Philo's answer to the cognitive dissonance between the Greek idea of divine law and the biblical representation of divine law was to refashion the Torah of Moses into natural law. According to Philo, the Torah was divine according to the Stoic understanding of that term, which means it is universal, utterly rational, true, and immutable. At one point, he even says the other nations will soon put down their particular laws and recognize that we have the universal law of the cosmopolis and follow it. Now, a second response to the cognitive dissonance, I will mention very briefly. I'm going to have to give this terrible short shrift. It is Paul's response. Paul was and it's complicated, so I'm going to give you a form that I hope will not bewilder you too much. But Paul was a first-century Pharisaic Jew who also evaluated his national heritage, the Torah, in the light of the Hellenistic understanding of divine law. But unlike Philo, he concluded that the Mosaic law really doesn't possess the characteristics of the natural divine law of the Greeks on the left side of your chart. For Paul, the Mosaic law looked a lot more like human positive law, has the earmarks of being the written constitution of a particular people. And some of its rules are even arbitrary and irrational, marking the people off as distinct. And of course, it's written. It can't possibly be identified with the universal unwritten law of nature inscribed upon the hearts of all humans. Now, I argue that Paul took advantage of this mismatch when formulating his mission to the Gentiles. As new scholarship on the New Testament argues, Paul was an ethnic exclusivist who believed the laws of the Torah were given to ethnic Israel alone, but he was also a messianist, and he believed that the end-time vision of the prophets, in which all nations recognize the God of Israel, only Israel performs the Torah laws, but all nations recognize the God of Israel, that day was dawning, wanting to bring Gentiles to the recognition of the one God, while leaving observance to the Torah's laws to Israelites only. Paul adopted rhetoric that he knew would speak to his Gentile audience and their understanding of divine versus human law. He described the God of Israel positively, but the law of Moses negatively, borrowing language from the Greek tradition that derides positive written human laws as dead letters that cannot bring true virtue or release from sin. He pointed Gentiles instead to the natural law inscribed on the heart. This was the Gentiles' path to the one God. The early church would, I think, misconstrue Paul as condemning the Mosaic law entirely for both Gentile and Jew. And in short order, the early Christian church would preach that the time for obeying the written laws of Moses had come to an end with the coming of the Messiah and the kingdom of heaven, and all persons could find salvation from sin and achieve true virtue, which had always been the Stoic goal as well, through the divine natural law inscribed on the heart, and not through the written laws for the community, the political community of Israel. So Philo and Paul are kind of similar in that they both accept the basic Greek and Roman distinction of divine natural law and human positive law, that binary. If you accept that binary, you have to decide where to place biblical Torah or divine law. Philo and Paul simply make different choices. Philo identified biblical law with the Greek and Roman divine or natural law and forced upon it all the characteristics in the left-hand column of your chart and none of those in the right-hand column, particularly the law's alliance with unchanging rationality and truth. Paul made the opposite move, I think, for strategic reasons. The law of Moses possesses the characteristics of positive law systems for a particular people. It's not eternal, universal, or unchanging. It's temporary. It's particular to Israel, and like all positive laws, it's even deficient in the quest for righteousness or moral virtue. Gentiles don't need to follow it, just recognize the one God. And the church would take this to mean that in the quest for moral virtue and salvation from sin, the law can and must be dispensed with in favor of the natural law written on the heart. But a third response to the cognitive dissonance is that of the Talmudic rabbis, the sages who between the 1st and the 7th century of the Common Era developed the classic works of rabbinic tradition, the Midrash, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. So in the last part of this lecture, I'd like to show you how the rabbis, by and large, resisted the Greco-Roman or the Greek and Roman. I've been told I shouldn't say Greco-Roman. That's a bad thing to say. So Greek and Roman conceptions of divine law and constructed a portrait of divine law in defiance of that conception. The rabbinic construction of divine law, or Torah, challenges the very idea that divine law is characterized by a conformity to some abstract truth, to a universal or by a universal rationality, and by immutability. And I want to consider each of those three characteristics in turn: conformity to truth, rationality, inherent rationality, and immutability. First, truth, which is so highly valued in the classical philosophical tradition. There are many fascinating rabbinic texts in which the Torah does not necessarily conform to truth. Now, it's hard to know what we mean by truth. We don't have a word in Hebrew that corresponds to the Greek term truth, referring to some abstract but sort of ontologically real notion of truth, aletheia. The word emet in Hebrew is not the same. So I tried to find functional equivalents, that is to say, objective standards or measures which are understood to be stable, against which Torah could be evaluated. And so ultimately I decided in the book that there are a number of different ways something can be said to be true. Something can be logically or formally true. 2 + 2 = 4, right? That's a logical truth. So does Torah correspond to logical truth? There's also judicial truth, which acquits the innocent and condemns the guilty. Does Torah always line up with judicial truth? Also, something can be true in the sense that it conforms to objective reality or empirical observation or nature. Does the Torah line up with empirical reality, nature? Well, it turns out that in rabbinic sources, the rabbis are quite comfortable with the idea that the Torah deviates from all kinds of truth. I'm going to give you an example first of the Torah's deviation from rational or logical truth. On literally hundreds of occasions, I picked one at random, I could have picked one of hundreds. On hundreds of occasions, the rabbis, when trying to ascertain what the law is, will stop and take the time to point out to us that the divine law doesn't line up with formal or logical truth. Here's an example. So this is text 5. For those of you who may not have read any sort of Talmudic reasoning, this might seem a little odd. We're more interested in the structure of this than the actual content, okay? It's talking about meal offerings, which are cereal offerings. So cereal offerings offered in the sanctuary, they might logically, if I were using logic, right, they might logically be thought to require the purest grade of olive oil. For if the menorah, the lamp, which is not intended for consumption, requires the purest grade of olive oil, then certainly the meal offerings, the cereal offerings, which are intended for consumption, well, isn't it logical that they should require the purest olive oil? But let's check Scripture and see what Scripture says. Scripture says in Exodus 27:20, you shall use the pure olive oil beaten for the light. It doesn't say pure olive oil for cereal offerings, therefore we should not use it for cereal offerings. How peculiar. That goes against logic. Now, you may be aware that they've manufactured Scripture's position on cereal offerings, right? From a verse that says, use pure olive oil for the light, they say, therefore, I cannot use it for the cereal offerings, which isn't quite what Scripture says. They've gone out of their way to manufacture a position, and then they've also gone out of their way to say, well, logically, I would have thought we would use pure olive oil, but we don't, and what can we do? We have to go against logic and reason. Philo would be turning in his grave. Philo would have done and does do exactly the opposite. He rushes to show the utter logic in every scriptural law, every dietary law, purity law. He wants you to understand that they are inherently rational. Nothing would ever go against logic or reason. Let's consider now judicial truth. The distinction that we just saw between the formally or logically correct law, but the actual operative law, the divine law, continues in contexts of judgment, where divine law occasionally deviates from judicial truth also. One rabbinic passage notes that Torah judges who render justice in a formally correct way through reason, which ignores particular circumstances, they are deficient. When it comes to adjudicating the law, an uncompromising adherence to truth, right, the single correct answer that would emerge from abstract study or theorizing about justice, this is depicted in several texts as dangerous. It is said that Jerusalem was destroyed only because people gave judgments according to the strict or formal law, din haTorah, when they should have stopped short of the strict or formal law, lifnim mishorat hadin. According to the rabbis, the pious judge will always apply the laws of the Torah with consideration for a range of values, not only truth, which is certainly a value and not one to be cast aside lightly, but there are other values that might compete with it, such as compassion, modesty, peace, humility, charity. And these values, once in a while, should override truth. God, too, the rabbis say, judges best when he doesn't focus solely on the truth. One tradition in the Talmud says that it's best to come before God in judgment in the second part of the day, because in the first part of the day, he's studying and he's occupied with abstract truth, and no one wants to receive a judgment based on abstract truth. God himself is also depicted in many scenes of divine judgment in the heavenly courtroom as urging various heavenly lawyers and advocates to help defeat the prosecution, to help his attribute of mercy overcome his attribute of true justice, sneaking them a little extra time for their arguments, and so on. According to the rabbis, the laws of the Torah also do not always align with physical truth or natural reality, right? Empirical science. And of course, in Stoic thought, divine law it's not just in conformity with nature, it is nature, right? It is the animating, governing principle of nature and physical reality. There's a text in the Mishnah, a 3rd century rabbinic work, Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, which contains perhaps the most well-known example of the idea that the laws of the Torah can defy natural reality. Here, a rabbinic sage, Rabban Gamliel, knowingly accepts false testimony about the astronomical phases of the moon. One had to give testimony to set the calendar and declare the beginning of each lunar month. He knowingly accepts false testimony about the moon, and he sets the calendar and determines the festivals based on this astronomically erroneous evidence. His colleagues object. How can you say that this is the first of the lunar month when that clearly isn't true astronomically? There's no new moon in the sky. You're going to lead people to observe the Yom Kippur fast on the wrong day and to eat on the real Yom Kippur, and that's a sin punishable by death at the hands of heaven, if you look at Leviticus 16. But Rabban Gamliel prevails. The rabbinic court has the right to set the calendar in defiance of astronomical reality, and God will respect it. Rabbi Akiva is another rabbi standing by who offers scriptural proof for this. This is a passage from the Babylonian Talmud reflecting on the case I've just described. And here he's going to point out that we have 3 verses in the Bible which refer to people fixing the calendar, right, or determining the festivals. So there are 3 different occasions where it says, you will observe my festivals. Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Joshua, who is one of the complainants, the text says you, 3 times in 3 different verses about the calendar, to indicate that you may fix the festivals even if you make a mistake inadvertently, you, even if you make a mistake deliberately, you, even if you're misled. And Rabbi Joshua replied to him saying, Akiva, you've comforted me, God is okay with this. The Torah doesn't need to conform slavishly to the truths of nature, science, or even empirical facts. And thus the rabbinic interpretation of Torah tolerates counterfactual rulings and legal fictions, as Roman law did, but of course there it was a human legal system. This is a divine legal system. These are tolerated, counterfactual rulings, legal fictions, if they help achieve humane and compassionate goals, such as the famous case of the woman who remarries after witnesses report incorrectly that her husband has died. When her husband returns, one authority allows the court to employ a legal fiction and declare that the man simply is not himself, so that the woman's new marriage is not disrupted. You laugh, but this happened in Ohio some years ago, where a woman's husband disappeared. She collected Social Security benefits for something like 30 years, and he returned. And it was impossible to repay the money, and so he was declared legally not himself, so that the bureaucracy could continue to do what it needed to do. So fictive legal presumptions are also tolerated, such as the Mishnah's presumption that all women are in a state of ritual purity from menstruation when their husbands return from a journey. Although clearly this will, at least 25% of the time, not actually be factually true. But it is in the service of the intimacy of the marital relationship that overrides the factual truth. So we've seen that the rabbinic understanding of divine law doesn't assume that it conforms to some objective standard of unchanging truth, but rather that it should perhaps nurture certain social and moral goods in specific situations. Nor do the rabbis think, moving on now to our second characteristic, typical of divine law in the Greek, in Stoic thought, nor do the rabbis think that the Torah's laws are all entirely rational or accessible to universal reason. Some are, such as the prohibition of murder or robbery or sexual immorality, absolutely. But for the rabbis, these aren't the laws that really mark the Torah as divine. After all, every human legal system has prohibitions of murder, robbery, and sexual immorality. They say even if these weren't given in the Torah, we would have written them down, right? These we can figure out for ourselves. No, for the rabbis, the laws that mark the Torah as distinctively divine are precisely the irrational laws, the purity laws, the dietary laws, other ritual laws that are commanded only to Israel and mark Israel as the covenant people of God. Again, this idea would have caused Philo's head to spin. This would have been anathema to the Stoics. For the Stoics, it is in virtue of its perfectly rational character that the divine natural law governs universal humankind, transcending and potentially dissolving the particular political communities that are created by written human laws. But for the rabbis, the existence of non-rational laws in the divine legislation serves another purpose. For while it's good to obey all the commandments, a special virtue arises from observing the commandments that have no clear rationale, that are illogical, arbitrary, counter to one's desires. We see in one rabbinic text, this is text 8, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, "How do I know that a person should not say, I don't want to wear mixed fibers," right? There's a prohibition against wearing a mixture of wool and linen. So how do you know you shouldn't say, that's okay, who really wants to wear mixed wool and linen anyway? I don't want to do it. You shouldn't say, it's all right, I don't want to eat pork. I don't want to commit an incestuous sexual act. Rather, you should say, I do want to do these things. But what can I do? My Father in heaven has imposed his decree on me. Arbitrary divine decrees, like the prohibition of pork, that serve no obvious rational purpose and even seem to go against human nature or appetite or desires, are, according to the rabbis, opportunities to show obedience and earn reward. In many passages, the rabbis point to the irrational nature of a law and say, what can we do? It's a decree of the king, and we obey it because it's a decree of the king, an opportunity to show obedience. So, again, sometimes they even manufacture the law's irrationality. They'll take a law that is kind of rational, but they'll sort of say it's irrational. Finally, according to the rabbis, the divine law is not immutable. On the contrary, the Torah is susceptible to moral critique and modification, and rather than being a sign of its imperfection, this flexibility is the very mark of its divinity. On many occasions, the rabbis will state what the divine law is, and then set it aside in favor of a better ruling, better in the sense of morally better. We see this, for example, in the Mishnah, in a tractate called Gittin, chapters 4 and 5, which lists a whole series of ordinances which adjust the divine law for the sake of the social order or the public welfare. For example, although by strict law, a husband is empowered to issue a divorce document and then subsequently annul it without his wife's knowledge, the rabbis rule that no, he just may not do so for the sake of the social order. The woman may think she's divorced when she's not. The document's been annulled. Although a slave freed by one of his two masters is technically half free, the rabbis compel the other master to free him for the sake of the social order again. Otherwise, the poor man can't marry. In short, for the rabbis, divine law doesn't always dictate the best and most desirable answer. This is very unlike Dworkin, right? The best law isn't always the right law, and the right law isn't always the best law. They will figure out, well, here's what the right law is. Do we like it? If not, here's a better law. And humans are therefore an essential partner in critiquing the law and making it better, usually based on an intuitive sense that the law is just wrong. In fact, the rabbis maintain that humans have enormous power to critique and modify a divine decree. Some texts are quite explicit in their aggressive criticism of some aspect of the divine law as morally inferior. And there are fascinating sources that describe God as being corrected by the moral insights and arguments of humans. A recent book published by a young scholar named Weis looks at 140 confrontational texts from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, many of which expose the moral imperfection of God, right, where a human confronts God about some flaw in his law. Sometimes God rejects or ignores the critique, but sometimes, significantly, he quite courageously admits his flaws and he adopts the more ethical stance proposed by his human interlocutor. He modifies his behavior or his decree or his law in response. We see in the next text from Numbers Rabbah, where God concedes to Moses' criticism of the principle of intergenerational punishment. Here it's referring to the passage in Exodus 34 where Moses wants to see and understand God, and so God is introducing himself or repeating his qualities to Moses and describes himself as visiting the guilt or the punishment of the parents upon the children. All right? When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, I am the Lord who visits the guilt or punishment of the parents upon the children, Moses said, wait up, master of the world. How many evil people give birth to righteous people? Should they take punishment from the sins of their parents? Terach worshipped idols, and Abraham his son was righteous. And also Hezekiah was righteous, and his father Ahaz was a wicked man. And he gives more examples. Is it appropriate that righteous people shall receive lashes for the sins of their parents? And God said to him, you've taught me something. By your life I will nullify my decree and establish your word, which explains why in Ezekiel it says each person dies for their own sin. Moses expresses moral outrage over the principle of transgenerational punishment, and God learns from him. He annuls his decree, establishes a new rule of individual punishment. In another instance, Moses teaches God that it's best to sue for peace before engaging in a war, and God is said in the Midrash to adopt this new policy in place of an earlier decree where one could make war without first attempting a negotiation. This also helps clear up a contradiction in the biblical law. In another passage, when Moses objects to the severity of the punishment of death by stoning for certain sins, God revokes that punishment and institutes flogging instead. In these cases, the rabbis present modification of divine behavior or divine law as the result of human input and revision. Well, it's a very short distance from the view that God consents to and is desirous of human assistance to modify the strict justice of his own decrees to the view that he needs it. A very dramatic illustration of God's dependence on human intervention to defeat him in the execution of his own flawed decrees is found in the next passage from Exodus Rabbah, a midrash in the book of Exodus. This is a midrash on the golden calf story. So according to the story in Exodus 32, the Israelites have committed idolatry with the golden calf while God is giving the tablets and the laws to Moses. There's this mass apostasy, and they worship the golden calf. And God, of course, is furious about their disloyalty, and he declares to Moses up there on the mountain that he intends to completely wipe out the people and start again with Moses. So he orders Moses to stand aside, but Moses quite courageously does not. And instead, the text says he implores. The Hebrew word here is vayachal. He implores God not to destroy the people. But the rabbis pick up on a word play or upon sort of the multivalent meanings of this verb, vayachal, and they connect it with another root, hechal, for absolving an oath. And this is what they say. Another explanation of the verse, Moses implored, vayachal, the Lord his God. What does this verse mean? It means that Moses absolved hechal, his creator, of his vow. How? When Israel made the calf, Moses began to entreat God to forgive them, but God said, Moses, I already took an oath, right back there in Exodus 22:19. Remember, we were just talking about it? I took an oath that whoever sacrifices to a god other than Yahweh alone shall be proscribed, destroyed, killed. I can't retract an oath which has proceeded from my mouth. I'm stuck. So according to the Rabbinic Midrash, God desperately wants to forgive Israel, but he can't. He's trapped by his law condemning the Israelites, or as idolaters, to death. So thinking quickly, Moses says, Lord of the universe, read ahead in Numbers 30, verse 3. Didn't you grant me the power of annulment of oaths by saying, if a man makes a vow, he shall not break, yachel, his pledge. That is, he himself cannot break his pledge, but a scholar can absolve his vow if he consults him. And he goes on to say in a passage that I eliminated here, but every good teacher should always model his teachings to his students. So you, God, really should be the first to model and make use of this particular law of having your oath absolved. So having persuaded God to this course of action, Moses sits like a sage to hear God's petition for his annulment of his rash vow. And the Midrash describes the scene in the continuation. Thereupon Moses wrapped himself in his cloak, the cloak of a scholar, and he seated himself like a sage. And the Holy One, blessed be he, stood before him. I see him there, hat in hand, looking very sheepish, petitioning for the annulment of his vow. What did Moses say to him? A shocking thing. He said, do you now regret your vow? He said to him, I regret now the evil which I said I would do to my people. And when Moses heard this, he said, it's absolved for you. It's absolved for you. There is neither vow nor oath any longer. And so, vayachal Moshe, and he absolved the vow of his creator. This is an astonishing portrait of God trapped by his own law of justice, which, unless modified, will lead to destruction, of a God dependent upon the ingenious intervention of a human partner to help him escape from the devastating dictates of his own divine law. This idea of a morally evolving divine being whose law should be subjected to moral critique and modified if necessary stands at a great distance from Stoic conceptions of divinity and the perfect, static, unchanging divine. To modify divine law on the basis of practical reason or considerations of equity would have been nonsensical in a Greek or a Roman context. It would be like saying, well, let's change the law of gravity today so I can drop something without it breaking. We'll reinstate it tomorrow. The divine law for the Greeks, of course, was an unchanging cosmic order. It just makes no sense to speak of its equitable adjustment. In fact, the opposite is the case, right? Human positive laws should be adjusted to conform to our best access to the natural law through reason. But in a paradoxical reversal, rabbinic sources depict divine law as undergoing adjustment in order to conform to human experience and intuition. Moreover, for the rabbis, the ability of the divine law to change and evolve is a function of its perfection, not its imperfection. A rigid, unresponsive law, that would be imperfect. The divine law's perfection is not diminished in the eyes of the rabbis by the fact that it is particular, flexible, responsive, rather than universal, static, and uniform. Its divinity and perfection are constituted by those features, and humans are active participants in its ongoing evolution. So to sum up, in the book I argue that the rabbis of the Talmudic era did not shy away from attributing to the divine legislation of the Torah features considered by others in antiquity to be unfailing indicators of a human positive law. The divine law of the God of Israel is not necessarily allied with truth. It's not entirely rational, and therefore it's not the law of a universal world community of rational philosophers, but the particular law of a political community of covenant members, and as we've seen, it's not immutable. In that respect, the rabbis resembled Paul more than Philo, but the difference with Paul is that the rabbis see these, as positive traits. They continued to insist on the divinity and the enduring relevance of the Torah, and in that respect, they resembled Philo more than Paul. But in a third respect, they resembled neither Philo nor Paul in constructing a portrait of divine law whose very divinity was enhanced rather than impugned by its divorce from truth, its particular and arbitrary character sometimes, and its susceptibility to moral critique and modification in response to the shifting circumstances of human experience. In this, they were entirely unique. And they were also entirely scandalous. To those who accept the Greek and the Roman conception of divine law, the idea that divine law is not self-identical with truth, is not universal and unchanging, is shocking, indeed laughable. You see why I'm going to write a book about humor. And I believe that the rabbis knew that. Theirs was a self-aware choice, because in dozens upon dozens of texts, the rabbis explicitly represent their conception of divine law as inspiring ridicule and mockery on the part of various outsiders, philosophers, heretics, Sadducees, and so on. Depicting themselves in these dialogues and conversations as ridiculed by those who claim that a divine law must be true, rational, and unchanging, the rabbis signal that they're very aware of this alternative view and they're consciously rejecting it. It's my contention that we're still wrestling with the cognitive dissonance that I described here, and that the consequences of failing to recognize this fact are grave. So in the last minutes, I hope you'll indulge me as I share a final insight that I've had since finishing the book. For all their differences, the Stoics and the biblical writers were driven, I think, by a shared vision. Each was seeking to ground written laws, the black letter rules and legislation governing human society, in an authority that transcended mere convention, but does not at the same time absolutize those laws. To connect the laws that govern us to some transcendent something, while retaining the possibility for critique and modification of those laws. To bestow written law with authority without immutability, authority without truth claims, authority without authoritarianism. It's a tough needle to thread, yet both traditions manage it, albeit in dramatically different ways. So in response to the sophists' attack on conventional law and morality as just arbitrary and meaningless, the Stoics sought to base law and morality on something transcending human convention. Rather counterintuitively, they chose nature. They broke with a long Greek tradition that, with some exceptions, saw nature, physis, as chaotic and antithetical to law, nomos. But against that background or that longer tradition, the Stoics asserted that nature was in fact governed by an inherent divine reason, a logos, that can be accessed by the rational sage. And with this unwritten divine logos in view, the fallible and mutable written laws of human states can be continually evaluated and refined by the rational sage. So by holding the written laws of states accountable to an immutable and true divine standard, the Stoics bolstered the written law's authority, right? The more in conformity with the rational order of nature, the more authoritative, without attaching to the written law of the state the qualities of immutability, inherent reason, and truth that in the Stoic view are the defining characteristics of the divine law alone and are lacking in even the best human laws. So human written law for the Stoics will always be in need of adjustment and repair owing to its imperfection. But it's nourished and monitored by the universal logos, and so its claim to our fidelity is more secure. A parallel achievement, but by other means, may be attributed to the ancient Israelites, who also sought to base morality and law on something transcending human convention, something unchanging and eternal. But instead of choosing divine reason in nature, they chose the divine will of a personal deity. Now, having a divine source enhanced the written law's authority for sure, but because that divine will is understood to be responsive, mutable, and not always rational, then the written law it produced was also understood to be flexible and dynamically responsive to the shifting circumstances of human life. So, as was true in the case of the Stoics, the positive written law of the state was rendered more authoritative, but not absolutized. Rather, it was understood to be susceptible to continual adjustment and repair, but now as a function of its perfection, not its imperfection, as for the Stoics. Because in the biblical view, that which is divine is perfect because it's dynamic and responsive, not because it's static and immutable. It's my contention, then, that both the Stoics and the biblical authors understood, and it is this they tried so hard to guard against, that to accord immutability and truth to written law is the first step on the road to authoritarianism, because the seduction of certainty and absolutes, even in the realm of the uncertain and relative, which is to say life, is beyond the ability of many mortals to resist. It's ironic, then, that when these two very different ancient attempts to render written law authoritative but not absolute encountered one another, there emerged a conception of written law that neither the Stoics nor the biblical tradition had wanted, and that each had taken great pains to prevent. The written Torah began to take on the traits of the unwritten divine law of Greek tradition, traits it did not possess in its biblical articulation, creating for the first time a positive written law deemed to be immutable, rational, ontologically and metaphysically true, divine in the Stoic sense rather than in the biblical sense, increasingly exempt from the refinements of moral reasoning and the adjustments of moral critique, resulting ultimately in the immutable and infallible Bible of Western tradition. Soon, dissent, argument, critique, calibration, and refinement of this written divine text would be perceived not as a built-in mechanism for its correction and evolution, but as heresy. And it is this that the dominant voice of the Talmud resists. As I have argued here, The Talmudic rabbis resisted the conflation of Greek and biblical notions of the divine and advanced a portrait of divine law that was not self-identical with truth and rationality, not universal and immutable, not immune to critique and improving modifications, and they did so in full awareness that they were a scandal to others. In the medieval and modern periods, the Greek binary of divine natural law and human positive law would become controlling paradigms in the West. And we are heirs to this tradition, whether we like it or not, with the result that we, often unwittingly, map onto the Bible the characteristic features of Greek divine law. And so for us too, the rabbinic construction of divine law, not inherently rational, sometimes fallible, divorced from truth, subject to change and evolution, can seem scandalous and even provoke a laugh. But I maintain that there is much to be gained from bringing the rabbinic construction of divine law out of the shadows, from considering the possibility that a law and a text can be thought of as divine without being universal, absolute, unchanging truth. The Talmudic vision is a difficult and demanding one because it requires constant work. It requires moral reasoning, debate, and argument, and subsequent Jewish tradition has not been consistently loyal to this vision through the ages. Today, Jewish law has its absolutist proponents who claim for its categories and norms an ontological status that renders them immutable and true, divine in the Platonic sense rather than the biblical sense. These deformations are understandable, perhaps. The search for solid ground, the yearning to be relieved of the burden of moral agency and to accept authoritarian absolutism is as strong today as it ever was. And as both the Greek philosophers and the biblical writers knew 2,500 years ago, it is no less dangerous. And that's a run-up to the State of the Union, isn't it? I just realized. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
We have time for some questions about the State of the Union or otherwise, whatever Professor Hayes will accept.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for those beautiful, eloquent, and clear, fascinating remarks.
Thank you.
I have a question about distinguishing biblical and Mosaic. You use both terms perhaps a bit interchangeably. The voice of, for example, in Psalms, in Tehillim, let's take chapter 19 of Tehillim. There is this very passionate exposition on, you use the Torah Hashem Kimimah.
Right.
Hashem Ne'emana. So they have a series of synonyms for what sound like laws, rules, statutes, ordinances, and they're ascribed adjectives like perfection, they'll endure forever, they're bright,
Yeah.
it sounds very stoic, like
Right.
that's biblical.
Yeah.
What do you think of the voice of
Yeah. So as I said, there are several discourses of divine law in the Bible, and I dealt with the dominant or main one here. That's really talking about the legislation, when it was given, how it's perceived, the fact that it evolves, and so on. Certainly in the poetic tradition, we have all kinds of praises of this is true actually of the divinity as well as the law, right? So you can find clear texts in the biblical tradition in which God is the God of Israel. Other nations have their gods. And then you come to Isaiah and there's the one universal God, the beginning and the end, right? So we do have different discourses and different cases in the Bible. And you will find Torah associated wisdom not only there, but of course very famously in the book of Proverbs as well. I am wisdom. I was with God at the beginning of the universe, at the creation of the universe. Starts to sound like some sort of universal principle at creation. So we have some elements of a notion of something associated with God, but never distinct from God or separate from God as an impersonal principle embedded in nature. That we do not have. We do not have a natural law position. But we certainly have some older ancient Near Eastern traditions of wisdom or justice belonging to God or being gods and being perfect and so on. That's a different discourse, but it is held relatively distinct from the legislation handed over at Sinai, which is spoken of in a different way. Nevertheless, in the book, I go into that discourse because that becomes the tools for someone like Philo and some of the others to wed the Stoic ideas to the biblical and say, see, to ignore the narrative context, to ignore what goes on in the Pentateuch, and to take some of these passages and hook Torah up to wisdom, to the order of the rational universe, and so on. So they are the resource that those folks will use when they try to construct the law that way, right? So it is a complicated, thick story. That's why the book is 400 pages. But that's exactly the kind of thing that's so fun to tease out, and how those ideas developed and who seized upon what verses to make it move in a particular direction. Yeah. Yes?
So what is the natural law that isn't written down, like we philosophize about, as opposed to what they actually put down in writing, which was not, of course,
Yeah.
so divine. And
No.
corollary to that question is, what real difference does it make how you view divine law if in the end, you're writing it down and you have a set of rules, whether it's what the laws that govern Athens or the laws that govern.
Right, so just to be very clear, for the Greek tradition, no written law is divine. It is always human, by definition. It is always human, and it can never lead to virtue, ever, right? That's very different from the biblical position, which understands the written law to be divine. I don't actually believe that the biblical tradition represents the law as leading people to virtue. I think it understands the written law to be something that will lead to the formation of a holy community or society. People will err and sin. That's why there's punishments. There's no requirement of perfection or virtue from it. So that's the first thing. The Greek tradition understands any written law as human. So your question, though, is, so what is this natural law? You know, the students in my class are trying to figure this out, too. The Stoics it's really difficult. Logos itself, right, just reason, order. That's just, there is order, and that's what they call the natural law. Because because nature is God, or nature is divine for the Stoics, then the order in nature is the reason in God's mind. That's how they bring these together. But there's no content. In subsequent tradition, right, in the West, natural law will start to begin to refer to something substantive, certain moral goods that are embedded in nature. So people begin to flesh out a content for the natural law. That is not the Stoics. That is not the Greek position. This is some rational order that the rationally perfect sage somehow, almost in a mystical flash, I think, sees and perceives and knows how to order his behavior and action in a way that is entirely virtuous. It's really very mystical, almost, as much as it talks about reason, right? But I think there's a deliberate effort to make it something that can never be fully realized in written form, so that we are always engaged in a posture of critique towards our written laws. I think the Stoics, in a way, were doing something similar to what the biblical writers were doing by grounding it in divine will, which can be changed and therefore also needs critique. That part of it I didn't see until after I wrote the book. Like, that part's not in the book. I hope that answers your question. I'm as puzzled as you are, and the Stoics were mocked, by the way, by others for this, natural divine law that they couldn't label, they couldn't give a content to, that they didn't know what it was. And later, people are so frustrated by that they start to declare that they have actually figured out. So Cicero said, Roman law, got it finally. Roman law finally got the natural law. And there are others who at times would claim that the laws of their state. But that is not the philosopher's position. Plato himself, in the Laws, has a wonderful dialogue where the claim by two citizens of two city-states that they have a divine law is slowly debunked by the Athenian stranger who keeps asking them questions. Oh, really? Does your law, has it ever changed? And they said, well, yeah, it has. And he said, so you think divine things are changeable? And they eventually realized that no human or written law of any state could ever be divine. But it's not a question with an easy answer. I'm sorry, they themselves. Chaim, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll continue with the reception. Yeah.
But how much is law efficient? What if we ask, let's divide that divinity?
Yeah.
Because it seems like these distinctions about the way God acts in the human level, right, are different than the way we
Understand the divine.
So, is this about law, or is this about divinity, or what is it saying?
Yes and yes. So I know it was over an hour ago. But at the beginning, I did say the Greek and the biblical conceptions of the divine are radically distinct, and insofar as they are distinct, their notions of divine law will be distinct. So for one, where the divine is a personal deity known through actions in history, so his law is going to be something that guides course of human events in human history. But for the others, where for the Stoics at least, where the divine is the animating rational principle of the universe, then law is going to be that actual so yes, the answer is yes and yes. It stems from very different conceptions of the divine, which is not to say that, you understand, I've given you the Greek philosophical position. That does not represent all of Greek thought on the matter. There are Greek traditions also that understand there to be personal deities who give laws, like Hergus received his laws for Sparta, from the gods, and that's why within Greek culture we have the same cognitive dissonance between those different parts of Greek culture. But I'm interested in the cognitive dissonance between the philosophers and the biblical tradition, right? But we could map a very similar story within the Greek world. Thank you very much. Thank you.